The Appalachian Mountains rise like ancient guardians, their ridges cloaked in mist, their valleys carved deep by rivers older than memory. In these hills, time moves differently. The world outside changes, but here, life clings stubbornly to the old ways. Families live and die on the same land their ancestors claimed, their stories buried in soil, whispered in the wind, and carried in the hush of pine forests. It was in these mountains, in McDowell County, West Virginia, around 1923, that the Hollister family lived apart from the world. Their cabin stood at the end of a narrow dirt road, the kind that turned into sucking mud after heavy rain and disappeared beneath snowdrifts in winter. For months at a time, the family saw no one, no neighbors, only the silent press of the wilderness and the relentless ticking of seasons. Jeremiah Hollister was a man shaped by this hard land, tall, bony, with a thick beard and eyes like sharpened ice. He ruled his home with the quiet authority of someone who feared no man but carried storms within himself. His wife Sarah had died in childbirth, leaving him with their only daughter, Martha. She was just a girl when her mother passed, her childhood swallowed by grief and isolation. Jeremiah never remarried. Instead, father and daughter endured the years alone in that lonely cabin to the outside world. The Hollisters were shadows. The pastor who made his yearly visits noted how Jeremiah's daughter kept her eyes low, answering in whispers. At the general store, she trailed behind her father, her thin figure half hidden, like a ghost in his wake. People spoke of them only in murmurs, and then they forgot. In the mountains, families often lived quiet, and quiet was rarely questioned. But quiet can also hide darkness. By the harsh winter of 1937, Martha was 20. The snow that year was cruel, trapping them in the cabin for weeks at a time. When spring broke and Jeremiah finally came down the mountain, townsfolk noticed something strange. He bought baby clothes. Martha had never been seen with any man. Whispers grew like weeds and spoken suspicions too terrible to say aloud. In June of 1938, Jeremiah called on the only doctor in the county. Martha was in labor. The doctor, a tired man who had seen much, arrived expecting a simple birth. What he found haunted him all his life. The baby girl was born with twisted limbs and features that told a story no one dared put into words. She lived for only 3 days. The doctor wrote in his notes that Jeremiah wept over the child with a grief that seemed too fierce, too intimate for a grandfather. The doctor carried that secret silently, but rumors clung to the Hollisters like a second skin. And still, life in the cabin went on. By 1939, Martha bore another child, a boy named Elijah. He had mismatched eyes, fused fingers, and a skull too large for his tiny body. But unlike the first, Elijah lived. For 6 years he survived in that lonely cabin, until a bitter winter stole his breath with pneumonia. Martha's pain was etched in her face, yet the cycle did not end. More children came, and more were buried. In 1944, she delivered a stillborn son. In 1945, a daughter, Ruth, was born with deep mental impairments. Jeremiah kept the family shut away, and the mountains swallowed their cries. Then came 1946. Against all odds, Martha gave birth to a child, unlike the others. The girl, named Sarah, was healthy, strong, and bright. She bore Jeremiah's likeness, his sharp features, his piercing gaze, but without the deformities of her siblings. For the first time, Jeremiah carried a child proudly into town. People muttered, uneasy, but no one challenged him. Sarah grew, and with her came questions. At school, she excelled, but her teacher noticed something troubling. Bruises on her arms, a haunted look in her eyes. One day, in the quiet safety of the classroom, Sarah whispered what no one wanted to believe. Daddy got angry because Mommy didn't want to sleep in his bed anymore. He says Mommy belongs to him. He says she always has, since Grandma died. The teacher's hands trembled as she wrote it down. But when she told the sheriff, he shook his head. Families in the mountains had their own ways, he said. Some things weren't meant to be meddled with. And so the silence continued, wrapping itself around the Hollisters like ivy around stone. By the winter of 1952, Jeremiah was an old man, though his eyes burned with the same cold fire. The snow came early that year, deep and unforgiving. When the thaw arrived in spring, a hunter stumbled upon a grave near the Hollister land. A crude wooden cross bore Jeremiah's name. The hunter approached the cabin, peering through the window. Inside, Martha sat with Sarah and Ruth, her face calm, almost serene. It was as if a heavy weight had finally lifted. Jeremiah Hollister was gone. The cabin no longer felt cursed. For the first time in decades, laughter could be heard, their soft, hesitant at first, then growing stronger. Martha planted a garden. Sarah played in the sunlight. Ruth, though impaired, found joy in simple things. Neighbors began to see them in town more often, and though the whispers never fully faded, there was a sense that something had changed, but the scars ran deep. Martha carried secrets that weighed on her soul, and Sarah, growing into her teenage years, would soon stumble upon truths that would test the fragile hope her mother had fought to preserve. With Jeremiah gone, the Hollister cabin seemed to breathe again. The walls that once echoed with his heavy footsteps now felt lighter, as though the wood itself sighed in relief. Martha, for the first time in her life, moved through her home without fear. She cooked without glancing over her shoulder. She sang while hanging laundry, her voice quiet but steady, like a bird testing its wings after a storm. Sarah, still a child, blossomed in this new world. She chased sunlight across the clearing, played with Ruth in the garden, and began to smile in ways her teachers had never seen before. Yet, even in freedom, shadows lingered. Martha carried scars not visible to the eye. In the stillness of night, when the mountains held their breath, she would wake trembling, Jeremiah's voice whispering in memory, telling her she belonged to him, telling her she could never escape. It was during those years that Martha met Jacob Wheeler. He was a carpenter, widowed young, who often traveled the back roads repairing barns and fences. Jacob was a quiet man, with strong hands and kind eyes, and when he first saw Martha at the general store, he noticed the way she kept her head low, as if expecting to be struck. Something in her silence spoke to him. Over time, his presence became a gentle constant. He would stop by to mend a broken gate or bring fresh wood for the fire. Slowly, cautiously, Martha began to trust him. Their friendship deepened, and eventually whispers in town turned to talk of marriage. But with that talk came crueler whispers as well. One neighbor's wife pulled Jacob aside, her voice low and sharp. "You know what they say about Martha, don't you? About her father, about those children." Jacob listened, but he did not turn away. Instead, he confronted Martha one summer night beneath the stars. Tears welled in her eyes as she told him everything, how the abuse began after her mother's death, how she tried to run at 14, only to be chained to the bed as punishment, how every child she bore carried the weight of her father's sin. She spoke not with shame, but with a quiet, broken strength. Confessing the truth she had carried for decades, Jacob did not recoil. He did not judge. He took her trembling hands in his and promised her that the past did not define her worth. It was the first time Martha felt what true compassion was. In his presence, she discovered that love could be gentle, not cruel. By the early 1950s, Martha and Jacob were married. The cabin, once a place of darkness, slowly transformed into a home of warmth. Jacob treated Ruth with kindness, never flinching at her impairments, and Sarah found in him the father figure she had never truly known. For a brief time, it seemed as though the curse of the Hollisters might finally be lifting, but the past has a way of clawing back. When Sarah turned 13, curiosity drew her to the attic. Dust coated the beams, and the air smelled of old wood and secrets. There, tucked beneath a loose floorboard, she found a diary, her mother's. Its pages told the story of Jeremiah's cruelty, of nights filled with terror, of children born not out of love but of violation. Sarah's hands shook as she read the words. Her stomach turned, and tears blurred the ink. She confronted her mother, crying, "So it's true. He was my father." Martha's silence was answer enough. Sarah screamed that she was a freak, that half of her was made of sickness and shame. But Jacob knelt before her, steady and firm, and said, "You are not defined by him. Blood may bind us, but choices make us who we are. And you, Sarah, are nothing like him." To ease her torment, Jacob arranged for Sarah to see a doctor in the city, a geneticist, who studied inherited conditions. The doctor explained that while Sarah carried the weight of her family's past, her future was not doomed. If she chose love outside the bloodline, her children could be as healthy as any others. For Sarah, it was a revelation. She was not cursed. She was free. With that knowledge, she poured herself into her studies. She earned a scholarship, leaving the mountains to become a nurse. There, in a world beyond the ridges, she met Michael, a kind and steady man who accepted her truth without flinching. When Sarah confessed the darkness of her past, Michael simply held her hand and said, "Your story does not scare me. It makes your strength shine brighter." Back in the mountains, Martha and Jacob lived quietly. Their days filled with small joys, gardening, tending to Ruth, sitting together on the porch as the sun set behind the ridges. For Martha, every ordinary moment was a miracle. She had known only fear for so long that peace felt almost unreal. But peace is fragile. Ruth's health declined as the years passed, and by 1970 she was gone. Laid to rest in the family plot, beside siblings who had never drawn breath. Martha wept, but her grief was different this time. There was no shame, no secrecy, only the sorrow of a mother who had loved deeply. Sarah, by then, was thriving. She married Michael, bore children free of the shadows of the past, and built a life that seemed impossible when she was a girl hiding bruises beneath her sleeves. Martha lived to see her grandchildren, to hold them and know that the cycle had truly been broken. She often whispered to Jacob, "It ends with me. The darkness ends here." In the early 1980s, Martha passed peacefully in her sleep, Jacob's hand still clasping hers. She was laid to rest beside him, her grave marked not by whispers of shame, but by the legacy of survival. For Sarah, her mother's strength became a compass, guiding her through every hardship. Yet the Hollister story did not remain buried in the mountains. Decades later, Sarah's daughter, Elizabeth, bright, determined, with her grandmother's quiet fire, stumbled upon their history while studying psychology. She discovered her grandmother's case in medical journals as patient H. The realization that her family's suffering had become a study in textbooks shook her to her core. She called her mother in tears, asking if it was all true. Sarah, her voice steady, though her heart ached, said yes. And together, mother and daughter returned to the land where it all began. The cabin was gone, swallowed by ivy and moss, the chimney standing like a lone sentinel against time. They walked through the clearing, silent, until they reached the family plot. There, Elizabeth laid flowers at Martha's grave, her hands trembling. She said nothing at the unmarked mound that held Jeremiah. For him, there were no flowers, no prayers. Elizabeth understood then. Her grandmother's strength endured. His sickness had not. Elizabeth grew up hearing fragments of family stories, whispers about the mountains, about a grandmother who had endured more than most, about secrets too heavy to name. Her mother, Sarah, had shielded her for as long as she could, but children grow, and questions sharpen with age. At university, Elizabeth studied psychology. She was fascinated by resilience, by the way human beings carried trauma like invisible scars, and how some managed to heal while others collapsed under the weight. It was during her second year that she stumbled across a journal article. The case was anonymized, the subject referred to only as Patient H. It told of a woman in Appalachia who had suffered decades of abuse at the hands of her father, who bore his children, who raised them in secrecy and silence. Elizabeth read with growing horror. The details were undeniable. Patient H was Martha Hollister, her grandmother. Her hands trembled as she turned the pages, her chest tight with a grief she had never known. The story was no longer a shadow. It was written in ink, clinical and cold, dissected by strangers. Her family's pain was now a lesson for others. She called her mother in tears that night. Sarah listened quietly, her silence heavy. "At last," she said, "it's true. I wanted to protect you from it. But you had to find it someday." Elizabeth asked why the world had to know, why their private suffering had to be carved open for study. Sarah's answer was soft but firm, because if even one life is saved by knowing what happened to us, then it wasn't all in vain. That summer, mother and daughter returned to the mountains. The road was overgrown, the forest thick, but the land remembered. The cabin where Jeremiah once ruled was gone, collapsed into earth and moss. Only the chimney remained, blackened with time, standing crooked like an old sentinel. Elizabeth walked through the clearing in silence, her footsteps stirring ghosts. She tried to imagine Martha here, a girl with no escape, a woman with no choice, yet still a mother who had managed to love her children despite everything, at the family plot. Elizabeth placed flowers on Martha's grave, her fingers brushing the cold stone. She laid flowers for Jacob too, honoring the man who had given her grandmother a final chapter of peace. But when she stood before Jeremiah's unmarked mound, she felt nothing, no grief, no obligation, only a hollow silence where forgiveness should have been. She turned away without a word. That day changed Elizabeth. What had once been shame became fuel. She decided she would not let her family's suffering stay hidden in footnotes and hushed whispers. She would give it a voice, not to glorify the pain, but to honor the survival. In her final year at university, she wrote her thesis on intergenerational trauma, weaving her grandmother's story into a broader study of how cycles of abuse can be broken. She spoke of silence and its dangers, of how families often bury the truth to protect themselves, only for it to fester in the next generation. She argued that resilience was not inherited by blood, but built in choice. Her words carried weight because they were not abstract, they were lived. When she defended her thesis, she told the room, "My grandmother was known as Patient H in the journals. To me, she was Martha. She was a woman who endured unimaginable suffering, and yet somehow protected a light strong enough to reach me, her granddaughter. That light is the reason I stand here today." The room was silent, moved not just by research, but by the raw humanity in her voice. After graduation, Elizabeth chose to dedicate her life to helping others heal. She became a counselor, specializing in trauma, sitting across from people who carried their own secrets. In every trembling voice, in every tear-filled confession, she heard echoes of Martha, and each time she offered what her grandmother had once been denied: understanding, compassion, hope. But Elizabeth did not stop there. She began speaking publicly, at conferences, universities, community gatherings. She told the Hollister story, not as a tale of horror, but as proof that cycles could be broken, that the darkness of one generation did not have to consume the next. People wept when they heard it. Others approached her afterward, confessing their own hidden histories, saying that hearing her gave them strength to finally speak. In time, Elizabeth wrote a book. She titled it, Shadows and Light, The Hollister Legacy. In its pages, she traced the arc of suffering and survival across generations. She told of Martha's pain, Sarah's courage, and her own vow to turn wounds into wisdom. Critics praised it as both haunting and inspiring, a work that exposed the darkest corners of human cruelty while holding fast to the possibility of renewal. The book brought attention. Elizabeth never sought interviews, invitations, debates. Some accused her of exploiting her family's suffering. Others praised her bravery. Elizabeth bore it all with quiet dignity, reminding herself that the truth, once spoken, belonged not just to her family, but to anyone who needed it. Through it all, she never forgot the land. She returned often to the mountains, walking the trails her grandmother once walked, listening to the wind that whispered through the pines. Standing in that silence, she felt Martha's presence, not broken, not shamed, but strong. One autumn evening, Elizabeth brought her own daughter, a child with wide, curious eyes, to the clearing where the cabin had once stood. The chimney was crumbling now, the stones slick with moss, but it still stood. Elizabeth told her daughter the story, careful not to burden her with every brutal detail, but enough so she would know. She said, "This is where your great-grandmother lived. She suffered here, but she also fought here. Because of her, you are free." The little girl nodded solemnly, as though she understood more than her years should allow. She picked a wild flower and placed it at the base of the chimney. Elizabeth watched, her throat tight, realizing that the act itself was a kind of healing the family's pain, transformed into memory, into resilience, into love. And so, the Hollister legacy lived on, not as a tale of shame, but as a testament to endurance. From Jeremiah's cruelty to Martha's survival, from Sarah's courage to Elizabeth's voice, the story became a chain not of bondage, but of strength. The mountains still stood, eternal and silent, but within them, the Hollisters had carved a truth that could not be buried. Darkness may linger for a time, but light endures longer. Elizabeth's book, Shadows and Light, The Hollister Legacy, found its way into libraries, classrooms, and homes across the country. Survivors of abuse wrote to her, thanking her for giving words to the pain they had carried in silence. Students cited her work in essays on trauma and resilience. Counselors recommended it to clients who struggled to believe that healing was possible, but with recognition came new burdens. Journalists called, hungry for interviews. Documentarians asked for rights to tell the story in their own way. Elizabeth guarded her family's truth carefully. She refused to let it be sensationalized. She told one reporter, "This is not a horror story. It is a survival story. If you can't tell it that way, you can't tell it at all." Her firm stance earned her respect. She became known not only as a writer, but as a guardian of dignity. At conferences, people whispered about her presence, about the quiet power she carried. Yet Elizabeth never sought fame. She sought connection. Each time she stepped onto a stage, she remembered Martha. She imagined her grandmother sitting silently in that cabin, believing she was alone, believing no one would ever understand. And she spoke as if she were speaking directly to her. Years passed, and Elizabeth's daughter grew. Like her mother, she was curious, thoughtful, and One day, at 16, she asked Elizabeth, "Why do you keep telling the story? Doesn't it hurt you every time?" Elizabeth paused, her eyes soft. "It does hurt," she admitted, "but silence hurts more. If I stay quiet, then his shadow wins. If I speak, then your great-grandmother's light wins. That's why." Her daughter nodded, and though she didn't yet grasp the full weight of those words, she carried them close. The Hollister name, once spoken only in whispers of shame, began to change in meaning. No longer was it tied only to Jeremiah's cruelty. It became tied to Martha's endurance, Sarah's courage, and Elizabeth's unrelenting voice. In academic circles, the Hollisters became a case study, not of deformity or scandal, but of resilience and generational healing. Elizabeth's work expanded beyond the written word. She created support groups in rural communities, places where silence still lingered heavily. She returned to McDowell County, holding meetings in small church basements, inviting anyone who carried secrets to come and listen. People arrived quietly, nervously at first, men and women who had hidden bruises. Children who spoke of nights they could not forget. Elizabeth listened to them all, her presence a balm. She never claimed to have easy answers, but she offered something rarer, proof that survival was possible. One evening, an elderly woman approached her after a gathering. Her hands trembled as she spoke. "I knew your grandmother," she said. "I lived up the ridge. We all suspected, but we were too scared to speak." Tears filled her eyes. "I'm sorry we didn't help her." Elizabeth took her hands gently. "You don't have to apologize," she whispered. "You're helping her now. Every time you speak, every time you remember, you give her back her voice." Moments like these reminded Elizabeth why she continued. The story was not just about the past. It was about the present, about every life still trapped in silence. As years rolled on, Elizabeth aged. Her daughter grew into adulthood, strong and independent. The chimney in the clearing eventually collapsed, its stones scattered and swallowed by moss. Nothing physical remained of the Hollister cabin, and yet the story endured. On the 50th anniversary of Martha's death, Elizabeth gathered her family at the old plot. The graves were weathered, their stones chipped by rain and wind. She laid flowers at Martha's side, her hands steady despite her years. She spoke aloud, her voice trembling but clear. "Grandmother, you once believed no one would ever know. You believed your pain would die here in the mountains, but it didn't. Your story lives. It has saved lives. It has given strength to those who thought they had none, and it will not be forgotten." Her family stood beside her, listening in silence. Even the children, too young to understand every word, felt the weight of the moment. Elizabeth's daughter, now a young woman herself, stepped forward. She placed her hand on the cold stone and whispered, "Thank you." It was simple, but it was enough. When they left the mountain that day, Elizabeth felt a peace she had never known. The story was no longer a burden she carried alone. It belonged to the family now, passed down not as a curse, but as a legacy of strength in her later years. Elizabeth continued to write. Her final book was not about trauma, but about healing. She wrote of gardens blooming after long winters, of rivers carving valleys yet nurturing life, of mountains standing eternal. She wrote that survival was not only about enduring darkness, but about learning to seek light. When she passed, her obituary did not lead with her family's tragedy. It led with her work as a counselor, an author, a mother, and a voice for the voiceless. The Hollister name, once chained to silence, was spoken with honor, and in the generations that followed, her descendants told the story, not with shame, but with pride. They told it as proof that no family is forever cursed, that even the deepest wounds can become sources of strength. The Appalachian Mountains remain, their valleys deep, their forests thick, their silence heavy. They have swallowed countless stories, some never to be heard again. But the story of the Hollisters lives on, not in the cabin that has crumbled, not in the graves weathered by time, but in the voices of those who refuse to stay silent. What began in shadows has become a legacy of light, and as long as it is told, Martha, Sarah, and Elizabeth live not as victims, but as proof that cycles can be broken, that darkness can be defeated, and that even in the loneliest corners of the mountains, hope endures.